What I'm going to talk about is this very innocuous sounding question: how can we know anything? But it's a much broader question than that. What is it that happens in people's heads that has to do with the outside world? So it's a very ancient question. The business of knowing something, of being conscious, the mind-body problem, it sort of begs every difficult question that people say can't be answered. How does the brain work? The brain is possibly the most complicated machine that's ever been known by humankind. Over the last 2,500 years, there have been a lot of incredibly intelligent people who have attempted to answer the question and who've contributed to it. Aristotle was a man who was loved throughout history by different religions, by different philosophers of all kinds. He first of all decided that the world was made of objects, and these objects came in two kinds. Objects that were alive and objects that weren't. Objects that are alive are recognized by the fact that they move around on their own, and that they procreate, and that they nourish themselves in order to procreate, and so on. So he defined the property between, say, a corpse and a live human being as the form of that corpse, and that every object has a form. So, for example, if someone were to ask me, what's this? I could reply, it's two bits of cardboard with some smaller bits of paper inside and a lot of things that look like words written inside that. At that point, I'm not describing the form of this object. I'm describing what it's made of. And this was the style of Aristotle. This is what he used to analyze everything, and it's called the holomorphic style. Holy for wood, morphic for matter. Towards the end of his life, he wrote this story of how the form of the body, or in a human being, what we now would call the mind, resonates with objects in the world. And that's how it is for him that you get to know about things. He didn't actually provide mechanisms for doing that, but he said that that's what has to happen. This is the conclusion we come to, because people do understand what's going on. That means that there's something they have internally which resonates with what goes on externally. There's one thing about Aristotle: he could get things incredibly wrong. And one of the things he got wrong was, where does this resonance take place? And for him, it was the heart, not the head. He just got it wrong. He wasn't a surgeon. He never operated on anything. He dissected quite a lot of animals in his lifetime because he was a great biologist. But he got that bit wrong, and this is the guy who got that bit right, known as the world's greatest physician, and that's Galen. He was a Roman who lived in Anatolia, and there's a very interesting place just at the foothills of Pergamon. Pergamon is a hill now in Turkey, and it's called Asclepius, and it was the world's first mental asylum. And he was a patient there first, and then became the sort of chief priest. But he laid down some of the laws of medicine, which are still followed now. He and Hippocrates was there as well. And I was there about 3 weeks ago, not as a patient, just looking at the ruins. It really is a very impressive place. You can feel the sense in which people were cured there. They were taken through a series of stages, some of which involved trying to sort out what their problem is from their dreams. The dreams were somewhat heavily induced with drugs, but put that aside. But that's where Galen came from. And now we come to the world's greatest philosopher. I mean, that's arguably the case, but I'm sure you recognize his face, René Descartes. He was again a philosopher who had never cut anybody up, but he was very impressed with pictures that he saw of the brain. And he discovered that there were areas of the brain that appeared to be empty. These are called the ventricles. And he discovered a tiny little gland, which is called the pineal gland. And then he noticed that people, animals, needed to move in a purposeful way, and he suggested that there was a sort of weak link between what goes on in the ventricles, which was a sort of spiritual activity, a totally independent spiritual activity that just was the mind of that organism, and it linked every now and then via the pineal gland into creating movement when it was necessary. That was incredibly imaginative, and it actually created what philosophers call dualism, which exists even today. You will find philosophers who will argue about this dual nature of mind and body, and then you have philosophers at the other extreme who say that mind and body are the same thing, or brain and mind are the same thing. Well, they're both wrong. We now know that the ventricles of the brain contain a fluid which is there just to cushion any bang you might have on the head and protect the brain. Whereas the pineal gland is the thing that is active when you have jet lag. It's a little gland that tries to keep the timing of your body in sync, and it goes wrong when you move from one part of the world to another, but that's all it does. So this great guy was wrong on those issues. He was right on many others, particularly in his mathematics. There is a Brit who got it right. It's Thomas Willis, a British doctor who decided that the brain wasn't just some sort of peculiar porridge that exists in your skull, but it was active in a way which perhaps Descartes had missed. And he actually coined the term neurology from the nervous system. So he suggested that there was an area of medicine which had to do with the brain, and so he was the father of neurology. Having founded neurology, Thomas Willis still didn't know what it is that you had to look for in the brain. What is it that causes the brain to act, cause the body to act in the way it does? And here was a guy, Schleiden, who was very important in this area. He discovered, or he made a pronouncement that anything that is biological must be made of cells, because that's the only process that will get the object in place. And he suggested that even the brain is cellular, and that there's something in the cellular structure that creates mind. Now, that led to an amazing debate, because having decided that the liver is cellular, right, and it does certain things, it receives blood, it secretes other things, okay, is the brain like the liver, or is it different? By different, is there something about areas of the brain, the cells of the brain, which is different in role, in what it does in the brain, from the cells of the liver. And a debate arose where both sides were taken up. The people who believed that the brain was like the liver were called reticularists, and the people who believed that there was something special about the cells in the brain were called neuronists. Now we get into sort of more recent times. This guy was an amazing neurologist. He studied the brain in great detail, but the part of the brain he studied was this bit at the back called the cerebellum. The function of the cerebellum is to control our movement, is to be between something we could call thought and something we call action of our limbs. And he discovered the most beautiful cells, the structure. I wish I had some pictures. I didn't have time to bring them. But the cerebellum is made of cells that look like trees. And they're sort of trees that go like this. And there are wires running down these trees, so they look like a bit like telegraph poles. And there is the input from the cortex comes in here, and movement comes out there. And so there's this tree-like structure, which also receives signals from the rest of the body that causes movement. And then we move on quite a long while, and we start seeing that anybody who worked on this area in trying to put some science into these cellular structures that appear to be necessary to have any form of understanding of the world would get a Nobel Prize. So here's the first one, an Italian by the name of Camillo Golgi. His main contribution was to develop a stain that showed just as clearly the cells of the cortex as Purkinje found in the cerebellum. And so now we could see the cells of the cortex, but he came to the conclusion that the reticular theory was right. He saw all these cells beautifully connected, but because in the cortex the cells are much more uniform, he decided that the brain was like the liver, and it had a sort of mass force activity. This was rather embarrassing for the Nobel Prize Committee, because at the same time there was this other guy by the name of Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who decided that the neurons of the cortex had just as much beauty and interest in them as the neurons of the cerebellum, and that they must perform some very specific tasks. And so the Nobel Prize Committee shared the prize between the two. They didn't come out on either side. Well, let me say that it's the neuronist side that wins in the end, because it was untenable to think that the brain can do what it does without the neurons doing something very special and different from neuron to neuron. Okay. So another Nobel Prize, 1932, a Brit this time, Charles Sherrington. He began to see that neurons were connected to one another, that a neuron had an output from which it connected to other neurons, and that these connections were somehow chemically mediated. And that there were chemicals floating around the brain which sometimes would make these connections and sometimes wouldn't. But his main contribution was the discovery of a thing called the synapse, which is the little blob that connects from one neuron to another. And this synapse has a variable property. So he discovered that the communication between neurons is somehow variable. Okay, and we're now getting closer to the 20th century. These two fellows were Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley. They made a great discovery, and that is that neurons not only have sort of variable connections between them, but they actually communicate through pulse streams. In other words, there you have in miniature a communication system which is variable which is encoded. These pulse streams encode something, they encode information. And so the nature of the brain, the nature of the mind, one begins to see is not necessarily chemical, it's not necessarily physical, but it's informational. And that doesn't go down well with a lot of people, and I'll come back to that later. But having discovered that, what can one do with the sciences of information to try and understand this brain thing a little bit better? So I now come to my hero, and let's see if you can recognize him. The granddaddy of information, that's a picture of him at age 17. He went to MIT, very precocious age to, he went to do a postgraduate degree at that time. And at the age of 20, he linked Boolean logic, which now is used almost totally to design any bit of digital kit you can think of. People at some point used digital Boolean logic. It was this guy who said, okay, let's make a link between Boolean logic and circuit design, and then we can have a proper control of the way these digital circuits can be designed. Then at the age of 32, he founded the sciences of information. You've gotten on as to who he is. He founded artificial intelligence at the age of 32 by being the first person to want to demonstrate that a computer is not just a number cruncher, but is a device that can perform intelligent operations, and he was the first person to write a program that plays chess, and his algorithms are still used in chess-playing machines today. He was the first guy to build a maze-finding robot at the age of 36, and some people only know him as a robot designer. He designed this little mouse that would go from a target to a home in this maze. He retired from Bell Labs and MIT at the age of 62, and then in his retirement he perfected his juggling and his unicycling, and he even built a juggling machine in the shape of WC fields. He took a puppet, WC fields, and put some mechanics into it, and it was juggling away. He died in 2001, and there's a statue to him in his hometown of Gaylord in Michigan. His name was Claude Elwood Shannon. And it's a very strange thing that if I give a talk like this in the United States, everyone knows who Claude Elwood Shannon is. Outside of the United States, he's virtually unknown. But he is the person who made the digital world possible, because he more or less coined the way that you calculate information transfers in bits. And I'll talk a little later on as to how this is essential now to understanding what it is that happens in the brain. We start looking at where all the bits are going. We step back a bit because Claude Shannon was working at MIT and Bell Labs over a long period of time. And a couple of his colleagues were these two guys. And they started asking questions as to what does a neuron do? How can we express it mathematically? Because at the end of the day, if we're going to have an expression, a clear scientific expression of how mind and body, brain and mind are linked, we need a mathematical equation. We haven't got it yet, but we're getting close. Okay, there were two amazing characters. Warren McCulloch, who was a brilliant physician, psychologist. Walter Pitts was an autodidact. He taught himself logic. He went to the lectures on logic by the greatest logicians of the time, and he just sat at the back of the class and then worked with Warren McCulloch. And the conclusion they came to was that a neuron performs logical acts. A neuron takes all the stuff that the neurons connected to it are feeding it and performs a logical decision, like an AND gate or a NOR gate or an OR gate, but with one great difference, one enormous difference, that these neurons could be an AND gate one day and an OR gate another day, mainly because of the changes in the synaptic activity that Charles Sharrington had discovered. So here we've got these neurons, and we have 11 billion of them or so in the brain. And they give us the most amazingly rich machinery that we all carry in our heads. Let me give you an example just to move away from that a bit. If I take a bit of brain, which is about 1/8 of an inch square, the number of states, the number of different patterns of firing of neurons that can happen in that exceeds the number of atoms in the known universe. Just this tiny little bit of brain. And so people say, oh yeah, but the brain couldn't possibly do this, that, and the other. The brain can do anything. It's got more than enough machinery available to do it. And it's these guys that were saying, okay, let's try and work out what the neurons do. So that had its good points and its bad points, because it's about that time, around about the 1940s and the 1950s, that psychologists like Brian Skinner started talking about the stimulus response model of the brain, the behaviorist model of the brain. That the brain is something that receives its inputs, its neurons are all going da-da-da-da-dum, they're all doing the logical bit, they're all performing logic, and they produce an output. And what's happening with learning or with changed thoughts is just that the patterns of connections between these neurons are changing. Well, that was obviously wrong, because the patterns of neurons can't change that fast, not at the speed at which we can think. And it's these two guys, the next two guys, who actually noticed that 1950-ish. The man on the left is Karl Lashley. He was a zoologist turned psychologist, and Donald Hebb was his student, his PhD student. And what they discovered was that between the stimulus and this response, I mean, they were largely theoreticians. They didn't do a lot of work on the brain, but they set up hypotheses which then people who do cut up brains could test, that there must be some neural activity which is a reverberation amongst the neurons, some information that's going round and round inside the neural network, which we call thought, and that there is this reverberation which goes between the stimulus and the response, which our mind is made of. So, you know, this has a certain ring of Aristotle to it, who said that we need a substance in our head that resonates with what happens in the world in order for us to understand the world. And there we are, these guys discovered where the resonance actually was. What they didn't know how to explain, they didn't know how it was that this resonance could make any sense. Why a resonance in its own right could be about anything, and it could provide the right relationship between input and output. But how could it make sense to the person who was producing the outputs? I went back, I was at the University of Kent at that time, and I thought that it was very important to ask this simple question. How does this neural network that reverberates make a contact with the real world? How can these reverberations be about something? Well, it turned out to be quite simple. That if one assumes that the information that's coming into the neural system also controls the connections in the neural system, that the connections don't just adjust to give the right reverberations that link input and output, but if the reverberations themselves are driven by the sensory data, and again, we go back to Aristotle there, who said that there were two things about the mind. One was its perceiving activity, and the other was its intellectual activity. And it's the perceiving activity which actually creates these loops in a sense that reflects the world. Now, to most of you, this might seem extraordinarily simple, that of course it's like that. Of course, if I see that lamp over there and then shut my eyes, that lamp's still there in a slightly less vivid way, but it's still there. And that must mean that my neurons are firing in the shape of that lamp. But that was missed for so many years. And we started building these, we started building simulations to show how this kind of thing can happen. Information theory is central to understanding the relationship between mind and brain. And so I'll show you a guy who's being talked of a lot these days. His name is Giulio Tononi. He's an Italian psychiatrist, actually, who works at the University of Wisconsin, and he's largely interested in dreams and sleeping and an entry into therapy through that. But he spent a year or two with Gerald Edelman at the Neurosciences Institute at La Jolla, and they published a book. And Tononi is rather good on mathematics, particularly the kind of mathematics that go into information theory. And so he made this rather incredible statement: to the extent that a mechanism is capable of generating integrated information, no matter whether it is organic or not, whether it is built of neurons or silicon chips or beer cans for that matter, and independent of its ability to report, it will have consciousness. This is an extremely strong statement, and it, let me say immediately, it hasn't been validated yet. He has some theories which show what a neural network has to do in informational terms in order to have a capacity for consciousness. But he still hasn't got around to how the consciousness actually gets there. This is where integrated information comes in. One of the things that happens in the things that we can be conscious of is that we are conscious of the causal relationships within the world that we experience. And the world that we experience is not arbitrary, and the representation of that world is not arbitrary. And a neural network has got to be sensitive to those causal activities. And that, in theoretical terms, is expressed using pure Shannon.